My journey began long before I could fully understand it, rooted in the very moment of my birth. I was born as the third and youngest child to my parents in a small town. They had 2 daughters before me, and I came along unexpectedly. My parents were not wealthy, but they had enough to take care of their 3 children. We lived in a modest ancestral house that helped keep living costs down, and my grandparents owned a farm that provided much of our food. My dad worked as a truck driver, coming home every few days, while my mom was a waitress. From the very start, I sensed that I was not what my parents had hoped for. My mother had wanted another girl, someone who could wear the clothes handed down from my sisters. They only had a year between them, so their clothes were almost interchangeable. When I was born, the disappointment was palpable. I was dressed in my sister's old clothes, including uniforms, and sent to school. I remember how humiliating it felt to be teased for wearing girls' clothing while my sisters got to wear new things. I didn't understand much back then, but as I grew older, I began to piece together the truth about how my parents viewed me. Instead of kindness and support, I heard harsh words and felt the weight of rejection. My mother often expressed her dislike for me while my father was away most of the time. While he wasn't as openly cruel as my mother, he was inconsistent in his behavior, sometimes siding with her and sometimes seeming indifferent to my struggles. I began to resent the treatment I received, feeling neglected and mistreated in comparison to my sisters, who always got everything good. As I grew more aware of the unfairness, I started to fight back. I was not an innocent child. I reacted to feeling unwanted and unvalued by acting out. I did things that sometimes led to punishments. I often had to prepare my own meals and sometimes even went to bed hungry. One particular incident stands out in my memory, and it marked a turning point in my life. I had been bullied at school for wearing girls' clothes and came home upset. When I found out that my mother had bought new clothes for my sisters, I lost control. Out of a mix of pain and resentment, I took scissors and cut the clothes into little pieces. I knew it was wrong, but I felt trapped in a situation where no one seemed to care about my feelings. Instead of understanding that I was expressing my hurt, my parents viewed my actions as the worst sin possible. Their reaction was not compassion but anger. They decided to put me up for adoption. They waited for a month, hoping someone would take me in, but when no one showed any interest, their frustration turned against me once again. I was constantly reminded of how unwanted I was, hearing my mother say things like how she regretted having me and wishing that she could have known beforehand that I would be a boy. Those words cut deep and left lasting scars. I often wondered why I had to suffer for something I didn't choose, for simply being born the way I was. As the days passed and no one came to adopt me, my parents began discussing my situation with friends and family. Eventually, they reached out to someone they knew in a nearby town who owned a food van and was looking to adopt a child. They were poorer than us but eager to have a child. Even as I look back on those moments, the feelings of rejection and sadness still linger. The thought of being unwanted, coupled with the harsh realities of my upbringing, shaped my early life in ways that are hard to forget. The pain of growing up in a household where love felt conditional has stayed with me, influencing how I view my relationships and the world around me. For over 10 years, my parents had been trying to have a child, but despite their hopes and efforts, they faced disappointment after disappointment. In a turn of events, my dad spoke to them about the possibility of adopting a child, and to my surprise, they quickly agreed to take me in. I still vividly recall the moment my dad shared this news with my mom and sisters. Their faces lit up with joy, and it felt as though they were thrilled at the prospect of welcoming someone new into their lives, albeit it was me they were excited to adopt. Dad gave a warning, letting them know that our family was not wealthy, and I might not have the chance to go to school. My mom, unfazed, shrugged her shoulders and responded nonchalantly, suggesting that they simply take me in without concern. I stood in the corner, holding onto the curtain, feeling a mix of emotions. Even though I had strong feelings of dislike for my family, I couldn't shake the fear and pain of leaving them behind. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I held back from crying aloud, feeling invisible amidst their celebration. It was evident that they were so consumed with their excitement that they forgot I was even in the room. When my dad noticed my tears, he walked over, rubbed my back gently, and told me to pack my things because we would leave for my new home the next morning. When I heard those words, the floodgates opened, and I cried out loud. But it seemed my cries went unheard in the midst of their happiness, so I retreated to my room to pack, praying that my new family would be kinder and more loving than the one I was leaving behind. The next day, as my dad drove me to the new town, I could hardly remember the feeling swirling inside me. I wasn't crying, perhaps due to a numbness that had settled over me as I left my old home and made my way to an uncertain future. Upon arrival at my new family's house, I discovered they were indeed living in modest conditions. Their home was small, just a single room that had been converted from a storage space into my bedroom. Despite the lack of space, I felt grateful that they had made an effort to provide me with my own area, as I had never had that before. My sisters back at my old home had comfortable beds, while I was relegated to a corner of their room where I slept on a makeshift cot, my belongings crammed into a tiny closet. This new room, while smaller than what I was accustomed to, felt cozy and warm. My new parents, Mary and John, were kind-hearted and nurturing, a stark contrast to what I had previously known. Coming from a troubled upbringing, I found it hard to embrace the love they offered. I had witnessed my biological parents showering affection on my sisters, but I never received that same warmth. This made me suspicious of Mary and John's intentions, and I was hesitant to open myself up to their love, fearing that I might face rejection once more. It took a significant amount of time for me to internalize that their love was genuine and not a temporary arrangement. Although I had to switch schools mid-session due to the move, my new parents assured me they would enroll me in school the following year. I began to observe the lengths they went to in order to save money for my education, which started to melt the walls I had built around my heart. Slowly, I began to love them back, realizing that my adoption was, in fact, a blessing in disguise. My biological parents never returned to check on me after sending me to Mary and John, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me. Here, I was recognized for who I truly was, a boy deserving of love and care. Mary and John were hard workers, often clocking in 14 to 16 hours a day operating a food truck located just outside their apartment. I was fortunate to be close by, able to watch them work from my bedroom window. Eventually, I started to spend my days helping them at the food truck, finding fulfillment in contributing to our small family business. When I eventually entered school, I dedicated myself to my studies while helping out at home whenever I could. By the time I was a little over 10, I took on some responsibilities at the cash register, where I discovered I had a knack for calculations. This early exposure to the workings of business and accounting laid the groundwork for my future ambitions. After finishing high school, my goal was to run the food truck full-time to support Mary and John as they aged. However, they insisted that I finish my college education first. They had managed to save enough to fund my schooling, despite their own hardships. They were growing older and weaker, and I wanted to take on the responsibility of caring for them as they had done for me, but they reassured me they could handle things for a few more years and encouraged me to pursue my studies. I enrolled in a business and accounting program, as I aspired to become an entrepreneur one day. Graduation day arrived, and it was one of the happiest moments of my life. Mary and John beamed with pride. They even reached out to my biological parents, hoping they would attend the ceremony, but unfortunately, they chose not to show up. After college, my desire was to take over the food truck and allow Mary and John to retire comfortably, but they had different plans. They had managed to save a significant amount of money and handed it over to me as a gesture of their love and support. Overwhelmed by this, John encouraged me to dream bigger, stating that they believed in my potential and were excited about my future. I was completely taken aback by his gesture. He explained to me that he and his partner could manage on their own for a few more years, but they didn't want to pull me into their situation. To support me in building my own future, he handed me a sum of money intended to help me start a business. I felt a strong sense of responsibility. I didn't want to waste his money without careful thought. Drawing on my understanding of business, I set out to find a small local eatery in a good location that was struggling with sales. My plan was to pitch the idea of leasing it from the owner on a profit-sharing basis. Initially, I faced several rejections, but I remained persistent and eventually found an owner willing to agree to my proposal. I started from the ground up, renovating the space and updating the menu to cater to the tastes of millennials and Generation Z. I focused on providing exceptional service to each customer, and through hard work and dedication, the sales surged within a year. I managed to double the profit on my initial investment. Fast forward 4 years, and I now successfully run 3 cafes in town. I was able to upgrade Mary and John to a nicer apartment, and I found a small place for myself after living with them for all that time. I suggested that they sell their food truck and enjoy their retirement, but they insisted on continuing with it because it brought them joy. When I packed up my things and left the house, I never imagined I would become a college graduate and now a business owner overseeing restaurant chains in town. Last month, during a regular day at work, something unexpected happened. While I was busy at the cash register in one of the cafes, I spotted a familiar face that sent chills down my spine. It was my biological father. After almost 2 decades, here he was. He looked frail and weak, yet walked over to me with a broad smile, embraced me warmly, and I felt taken aback. Since there were customers around, I led him to a quieter corner. His presence resurfaced haunting memories from my childhood, and I realized I wouldn't have been able to articulate my past without this encounter. He expressed his joy and pride in my accomplishments, and I stood there in shock, unable to find any words. He explained that he had been passing by when he met John, who informed him about my successful ventures. He even mentioned wanting to bring my mother to see me over the weekend. I chose not to respond and he left shortly after. After finishing my workday, I approached John and confided in him about my desire to avoid having any interaction with my biological parents, who had disowned me for simply being a boy. Given my difficult childhood, I felt the urge to escape and hide from the situation that lay ahead. However, Mary encouraged me to consider forgiving my parents and moving forward with my life. I reluctantly agreed to meet them, but only on the condition that both Mary and John be present for support. On the planned day, my biological parents arrived at John's house. I expected them to offer apologies for the pain they had caused me in the past, but instead, I was met with utter disbelief. They seemed to show no remorse whatsoever. My mother had the audacity to suggest I should be grateful to them for finding me such good parents who raised me to be successful. I was shocked to hear those words and wanted to respond, but Mary gently squeezed my hand, urging me to stay calm. I managed to diplomatically express how blessed I felt to have John and Mary as my true parents. The entire meeting felt overwhelmingly awkward for me. The next day, I received a call from my mother. Her voice was unrecognizable to me. It felt surreal since it was the first time she had contacted me in 2 decades. To my dismay, she was asking for money. She explained that my father had lost his regular job and had only been able to find work on a contractual basis for some time. Additionally, she claimed she had lost her job because no restaurant would hire a 50-year-old waitress and they were struggling to make ends meet. When I asked how much they needed, she said $20,000 would be enough. She revealed she had borrowed money from friends to get by over the past few months, and with her friends now demanding repayment, she was feeling the pressure. I ended the call by saying I would think about it and get back to her. Inside, I was grappling with conflicting feelings. No matter how much I resented them, I felt a twinge of sadness knowing that others were pursuing them for money. Part of me wondered if she was just trying to exploit me, yet another part felt guilt at the thought of them facing hardships. I knew I had the means to assist them, but I was caught in a moral dilemma. A while back, I decided to help my mom out with $20,000. After making that decision, I talked it over with Mary and John. Mary was supportive. She liked that I was thinking about my parents and helping them out. However, she also reminded me to be careful. John had a similar reaction. He also thought it was my money and that I should make my own choice. He shared my worries about the possibility that my parents might be trying to use my emotions against me. After thinking about it for a long time, I finally made the decision to trust my instincts. I took a leap of faith and sent the money to my mom's account. Even though my parents had not always been kind to me in the past, I felt good knowing I was able to support my family. However, I couldn't shake off the nagging feeling that I might have made a mistake, and I was right to worry because it became clear they were trying to take advantage of me financially. Just a week after I transferred the money, my mom called me again. I answered the call with a mix of emotions. I was both happy and cautious. She thanked me for the financial help, but then she mentioned that my sisters wanted to see me. She asked when I could come to visit. At that moment, I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe my family was genuinely interested in reconnecting. I knew my parents had hurt me deeply during my childhood, and I had a lot of anger towards them. But I never felt that way about my sisters. I had always cared for them. As a child, I might have acted out, but as I grew up, I realized it wasn't their fault that I had a tough upbringing. Part of me wondered if my parents had pushed me away because of their financial struggles rather than out of malice. I told my mom that I could come home on the following Sunday and that I would drive over. However, she quickly suggested we meet somewhere outside instead of at home. I didn't think much of it at the time and agreed to her plan. She promised to send me the details of the time and place. Once I hung up, though, I felt a little uneasy. It struck me as odd that she didn't want to meet at home after so many years apart. When you haven't seen your family in so long, wouldn't you want that reunion to happen in a familiar, comfortable place? Eventually, she sent me the information, and it turned out we were meeting at one of the fanciest restaurants in town. I didn't dwell on that detail because I was still caught up in my worries about why my mom chose a restaurant instead of our home. When I arrived at the restaurant, my sisters were already there. They rushed to greet me with hugs, and for a moment, I was happy to see them after so long. We were enjoying ourselves, reminiscing and catching up until the server brought the menu to our table. That's when things took a turn. As they started looking through the menu, I noticed they kept pointing out the pricier dishes. When it was time to ask my dad what he wanted, he just smiled and said, "Order the most expensive one." My son is a big man now. That felt especially petty coming from him. If it had been John or Mary making that comment, I might have felt proud, but hearing it from my biological parents just felt cruel. I sat there in silence, watching my family indulge themselves with my money, feeling increasingly frustrated. My mind raced with thoughts about just leaving before the bill came, but I knew that would be too harsh. While we were there, I made a silent vow to myself that I would never let them manipulate me emotionally again. The rest of the evening was filled with tension for me, while they seemed completely oblivious to my discomfort. When it was time to leave, they didn't even invite me back home. Instead, my older sister asked, "So, where are we dining next?" I forced a smile and said, "Nowhere," then waved them goodbye as I left. I returned home and told Mary about the entire experience. She was shocked and disturbed by their behavior. As a kind and independent woman, she advised me not to let them take advantage of me and urged me to focus on my own life. I took her advice to heart. My sisters called me after a week or so, but I chose not to respond. My mom also attempted to reach out, but I ignored her calls too. That was 2 months ago, and now they have stopped contacting me altogether. I believe they finally understood that I no longer wanted them in my life. Recently, about 5 months later, I received a call from my mom again. When I saw her name flashing on my phone, I decided to answer without really thinking about it. She started off the conversation with some small talk. Small talk can often feel insincere and superficial, particularly when it involves personal subjects. I found this to be the case during a conversation with a woman who, instead of engaging in genuine dialogue, began asking about me and my work in a way that felt forced and pretentious. Struggling to tolerate the artificiality of the exchange, I confronted her directly, asking what she truly wanted. After taking a deep breath, she revealed that her sisters had to drop out of college because their father could not afford to pay for their tuition fees. She informed me that her sisters were looking to me for financial assistance to fund their education. Upon hearing this news, I became extremely upset. She urged me to calm down, insisting that they were my sisters and my family, and that it was my duty to help them. At the time, I was at work and did not want to let this situation cloud my professional responsibilities, so I ended the call. Later that evening, when she called again, I hesitated, ignoring her a few times, but the guilt of leaving it unresolved began to weigh on me. I eventually decided to answer the call, only for her to enthusiastically mention how excited her sisters were to return to college, and she began discussing payment options. She suggested that I transfer the full amount to her so she could handle the tuition payments each semester. I was taken aback by her expectation and firmly stated I would not be making any payments. Her surprise was palpable. She had not anticipated that I would refuse her request outright. When she proposed the idea of paying in installments, I reiterated my position, explaining that my elder sister's education was not my responsibility, especially considering that my parents had abandoned me and had not been in touch since then. I felt that their current outreach was purely a means to access my financial resources. This assertion made her furious. In her anger, she reminded me that they were my parents and that everything I was today was because of them. She insisted that I had a responsibility to take care of my family. Although I had much to say in response, it felt futile as she was not open to understanding. I simply replied that while I did owe much to my current parents, John and Mary, who had raised and supported me, I did not recognize the people I had been born to. I had no memories or connections to them, my documentation bore no mention of their names, and I had no photographs with them. Her reaction was one of rage, hurling insults at me, but I calmly told her she had the wrong number and hung up. Regardless of how she or anyone else labeled me, selfish or cruel, I refused to squander my hard-earned money on those whom I did not view as family. They had distanced themselves from me when I was only 6 years old. Regarding my current parents, I did call them mom and dad, but that attachment developed over time as they took me in, educated me, and truly loved me. For clarity in retelling this narrative, I referred to them by their names. John and Mary are my real parents in every sense that matters to me, while I do not recognize my biological parents at all. The next chapter of my life brought me to a profoundly painful realization when I discovered that my wife had been unfaithful to me with someone she met at a convention. My wife and I had been married for about 5 years, and during that time, we had cultivated a loving and enjoyable relationship centered on shared interests in gaming, anime, and various aspects of nerd culture. She meant the world to me, and I always believed our relationship was strong. We had quickly fallen in love, even before marrying 3 years later, after meeting at a convention where we bonded over our mutual love for The Legend of Zelda and discussed the latest chapters of One Piece. Some people search for that special someone to complete their lives, and for me, that person was my wife. Our wedding was a fun, themed affair, encouraging our guests to embrace their favorite characters. However, as time passed, our jobs and their associated costs prevented us from attending conventions together, leading to fewer opportunities to enjoy our shared passions. With our 5-year anniversary approaching, I was determined to make it a memorable occasion, despite the limited resources we had. Little did I realize that my trust and commitment would soon be tested in the most devastating way. I didn't earn a large income, but it was enough to support her. For her birthday, I wanted to do something special and unexpected, so I surprised her with tickets to one of the most popular comic conventions. This was an event that many fans dreamed of attending, and her excitement was contagious. I shared in her joy and felt thrilled about going with her. When it came to women, I had never been particularly good at sensing interest. I often realized too late when someone liked me. Even in my relationship with my wife, it took me 3 entire conversations on Discord before I recognized that she was attracted to me and wanted to connect on a deeper level. At the convention, everything was going wonderfully. I had put together a stormtrooper costume at the last minute, and to my surprise, a girl dressed as Princess Leia complimented me enthusiastically. After she walked away, my wife pulled me aside to express her thoughts about how much attention I was getting from the girl. I was taken aback, admitting that I hadn't even noticed her excitement. I had always been bad at reading social cues, and my wife seemed a bit frustrated about it. Nevertheless, we brushed it off and continued enjoying the 3-day event. As the day progressed, we attended a meetup where a guy dressed as Han Solo approached. My wife, who was dressed as Princess Leia, started chatting with him, and I noticed they seemed to be getting closer. I felt the need to step in and remind him that I was her husband. Although he acknowledged me politely, he avoided making eye contact. Once he left, I confronted my wife about the interaction. She reassured me that nothing was going on and that the guy was merely a nice person who admired my costume. Given that she was the bigger Star Wars fan, I decided to brush it off as harmless. The next day, however, my wife woke up feeling sick and exhausted. I offered to head down on my own, promising to return later. Even though I left, I couldn't shake the feeling from the previous encounter. I thought perhaps I was being overly sensitive. But when I tried to reach her through messages, she didn't respond, which was unusual. We still had a full day left at the convention, and I picked up a small gift for her, hoping it would cheer her up. When I returned to our room, I heard some strange sounds that resembled moans. I quickly dismissed them, assuming it was just my wife. However, when I opened the door, I found her looking at me, and from her expression, it was clear something had happened. I confronted her, but she insisted that nothing was wrong. I looked around the room for any signs of something unusual but found nothing, so I let it go. As the convention wrapped up, my wife began to seem increasingly distant. She started working longer hours and came home completely worn out. When I suggested watching a movie together, she would always decline, saying he was busy. The strange moans I had heard earlier kept replaying in my mind, and I noticed her Discord notifications were turned off, which was odd because she had never done that before. Feeling suspicious, I decided to check her phone, surprised to find that the passcode was still the same. As I read through her messages, my heart sank. They were from the guy she had met at the Star Wars meetup. Their conversations were full of flirtation, and they had sent each other pictures. He even suggested role-playing, and she seemed eager about it. I dropped her phone in anger, pretending I hadn't seen anything. When my wife asked if I was okay, I lied and told her everything was fine, even though it was far from it. I began researching how to get a divorce, knowing it would be difficult, but I wanted to make sure she knew that I was aware of everything. I casually mentioned another convention coming up and said I wouldn't be able to attend, but she could go without me. Her eyes lit up at the idea, even though I was heartbroken. This was the person I had intended to spend my life with, and it felt like a sharp blow to my heart, but I managed to hide my feelings. On the day of the convention, I put my plan into action. After gathering information on the guy, I discovered that he and my wife worked closely together. I attended the convention and kept my eyes peeled until I spotted them together, right in front of her favorite voice actors. I wore a mask to obscure my identity and followed them closely, watching their every move. When they got closer to the front of the line, the voice actor asked my wife about her day, and she turned to the man beside her, pulling him into the conversation that was meant for us. She pulled the man closer, whispering that she was having a wonderful day. Their lips met in a kiss, a moment that seemed to freeze time. That's when I decided to take action. I moved right in between them, ripping off my mask, my eyes locking onto my wife's. Her hand dropped away from him as she looked up at me in surprise. "What are you doing?" she asked, confusion evident in her voice. I confronted her, my heart racing, insisting that I had caught her with him, that my wife had betrayed me. She quickly denied it, claiming that it wasn't true. But I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I slammed the Discord messages down on the table in front of everyone. The people around us gasped, shocked at the confrontation unfolding before them. I wanted everyone to know the truth. I announced that my wife was a cheater and that she had been unfaithful to me with this guy, whom she had met at a convention. The celebrity, visibly uncomfortable, stood up and said he needed a break before disappearing out of sight. I turned back to my wife, whose eyes were filled with tears. She pleaded with me to hear her out, but I couldn't. I reminded her of the lies, how she told me she was going somewhere alone while I knew she was with him. I mentioned the late nights she claimed were spent gaming with friends. When I called those friends, they told me they hadn't heard anything about a gaming night because they were too busy preparing for the holidays. Standing there, she looked embarrassed, her face flushed. Then she dropped a bombshell. She wanted an open relationship. She said she had thought about asking me first. I was furious. I didn't want to hear this. Her reasoning only added to my anger. Yes, she was upset with me for stepping in the way I did, but it didn't erase the fact that she had crossed a line. When we got home, I gathered my belongings, resolved to stay at a hotel. As I packed, I reached out to an attorney to begin the divorce process. She tried to persuade me to stay, suggesting an open relationship where I could be with other women while she saw men. It was absurd. I wanted her. She was my everything, my partner in life. My actions had consequences. Someone recorded the scene and shared it all over social media, making the situation even more public and embarrassing for her. I proceeded with the divorce, managing to secure the house and all our belongings. But I didn't want to keep any of it. I sold everything because I didn't want to be reminded of the painful memories of our time together. I lost track of what happened to my wife after that. The nerd community buzzed with gossip about the fallout, and it became a trending topic on Twitter and other platforms. Eventually, her boss found out about the incident, but I never discovered whether she kept her job or not. Frankly, I didn't care anymore. My quest for love continued, but it would not be with a woman who had betrayed my trust like she did.